will be on sale immediately following his talk. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium Mr. Tim Wise.
Really? Haven't done anything yet. I mean, if that's for some past shit, I don't know if I can live up to whatever that was. There was some of it over here too, so I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with you people in the middle. You didn't do any of that shit at all. Thank you for being here. It's good to be back in Sacramento. It's been a little while, I think since last time I was at Sac State, maybe 3-4 years ago. Haven't had a chance to be on your campus before, but glad to be here, especially with this lovely backdrop behind me. I'm going to do some shopping when we're done. I'm going to pull some clothes off the rack. Anyway, it's great to be here. So we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to sort of avoid the perfunctory things other than just to thank the folks, obviously, who made it possible for me to come. I won't mention them all by name, A, because it'll take a long time, and B, I don't really know everybody's names, so who am I fooling? I just need to jump right in and give the damn talk. But what I do want to do to start out and sort of just jump right in is say something. The other day I was in Portland actually for the last 4 days, and a couple days ago had the opportunity to attend a private screening that was being held for some high school students in Portland of the James Baldwin documentary that was just nominated for an Academy Award this past year called I'm Not Your Negro. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, if it's still being shown in the Sacramento area. If you have seen it, you know what a brilliant film it is. If you haven't, I really highly recommend that you do if it's still available. It was really powerful to watch this film that brings the words of someone as important to understanding race in America as James Baldwin to a bunch of 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds who were the bulk of the people in the room. And it reminded me of why I always tend to start my talks with a quote from James Baldwin, who I think is inarguably one of the finest, if not the finest writers ever to put pen to paper or typewriter keys to paper, as the case might be. And though he died 30 years ago, this year, his words are still incredibly prescient. Let me start with one such statement of his that I think frames my comments today, but also is pretty significant at framing the larger issue of race in America as we face it in 2017. James Baldwin wrote the following in 1965. He said, "People who imagine that history flatters them, as it does indeed since they wrote it." See, that's a brilliant line, right? Sometimes I just want to stop. There's more to this statement, and I'm going to share it with you. But that's really hot, right? People who imagine that history flatters them as indeed it does since they wrote it. I don't even have to finish the sentence. Just that little phrase is smarter than most things most people say, right? Because it suggests this power dynamic that is at the root of race. Anyway, back to the statement. People who imagine that history, and he was talking about white people, just in case we're not clear on that. Just so we're clear, people who imagine that history flatters them as it does indeed since they wrote it are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world. This is where it appears to be most white Americans find themselves, impaled. They are dimly or perhaps vividly aware that the history they have fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they do not know how to be released from it, and they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. That's some really good shit. That's meaning. People don't write like that anymore, and it's one of the reasons it takes a minute for words like that to really sink in. But that really is the kind of stuff I could just sort of take this and drop this and leave, and I wouldn't even have said any of my own stuff. It would just be me telling you Baldwin and saying, go forth and watch this film and prosper and all that kind of stuff. What was Baldwin really saying? Let's sort of break it down. Well, I'll give you another example, sort of a shorter version of what he meant. Many years after I first read those words, I had the opportunity to be in a session, a day-long workshop where I was going to be speaking, but before me, a man by the name of Randall Robinson was speaking. For those who remember the anti-apartheid struggle of the 1980s, You'll recognize Robinson's name. He was the founder of Trans-Africa. He was one of this country's most prominent anti-apartheid activists vis-a-vis South African apartheid. And he has since left the United States, wrote a really amazing book about that called Quitting America, why he essentially left, went with his wife to St. Kitts, which is where she's from, and now considers himself an expat and sort of in exile in a lot of ways from the United States after living as a black man in this country for a long time and experiencing institutional racism throughout the course of his life. He was speaking before me, and he stood up and he made a comment, not maybe as poetic as Baldwin, but sort of in the same vein. He said, if you don't understand what came before, if you don't understand the predicate, the preface, the precursor to the things that you see today, then you won't be able to make sense of the things that you see. They don't make sense if you don't understand what came before, right? And this is a rather obvious comment in a lot of ways, right? It's like with any of us, taking it out of the realm of race and politics and ideology and society, just thinking about yourself personally, right? We all have certain dysfunctional family things that maybe we don't like to talk about with people. Even sometimes our best friends don't know about some of the jacked upness of our family lives and our upbringing, right? But if you don't understand that dysfunction, right, you sometimes can't understand why you do the stuff that you do, right? And why maybe you treat people in certain ways that you know you shouldn't, and some of the dysfunction that you pass on to your children when and if you have them, right? But if you understand some of the stuff that came before, then you can sort of piece that together and maybe get a hold of it, right? Going back to Baldwin, if you understand history, you might have a shot of being released from it. If you make certain moves, right, to justify that release. But if you don't understand the past, whether it's your own, right, whether it's my own, or whether it's the society's past, then you can't possibly get a grip on it, and you certainly can't, nor do you deserve to be released from it. Well, I think all of those words, Baldwin's and Robinson's, and what I've just mentioned in that same vein, is something that certainly speaks to our current political moment, and more importantly, our current moment around race. Let me give you an idea of what I mean. If you don't understand the predicate to the racial inequalities and disparities that exist in this country, you won't be able to make sense of those, and you won't be able to make sense of the response that people have to them. So, for instance, if you don't understand the history of law enforcement, and particularly law enforcement misconduct in communities of color, a movement like Black Lives Matter will seem odd to you, maybe even threatening to you, maybe bizarre to you, because if you don't have a clear sense of how much Black lives haven't mattered in this country's history, and particularly to law enforcement, then when people stand up to proclaim that Black Lives Matter, we, at least some of us, will take it as a direct threat to our identity. We'll get tripped up on it and say things like, well, what? What do you mean, Black lives? What about my life? What about my life matters, doesn't it? All lives matter. I know, precious. I got 2 teenage daughters, and they're white. That's what happens when white people make babies. You don't need to tell me that their lives matter. I'm very clear on that. I am their father. The difference, however, is all the cops know their lives matter. Right. And the teachers already know their lives matter. Right? And the employers all know that their lives matter. And the loan officer at the bank knows that their lives matter. Right? You don't have to proclaim that about my daughters. You have to say all. We get that. We get that about everybody, except those we've forgotten. Right. You have to specify that which has been neglected, see? But if you don't understand history, this won't make sense to you. Like, for instance, if you don't understand history, you won't remember the fact that white America has a really long history of saying all and not meaning it. Right. So we said, did we not? I mean, we didn't, but Thomas Jefferson did, and he's one of white people's favorite white people, from what I can gather. Thomas Jefferson said, his words, not mine, his words, Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But now, when he wrote those words, he owned over 275 other human beings, so I think he didn't mean it. Right. And in the 1880s, when the first version of the Pledge of Allegiance was written, there have been several versions, started in the 1880s, got a new one in the 20s, all the way up to 1954. The last line, though, has always been the same. With liberty and justice for all, there's that word again, all. And some white folks said it when they wrote that, and they didn't mean it, certainly not in the 1880s. Come on now, 1920s, 1950s, regardless of what you think about racism in 2017, I think we can all at least agree that in those periods of time, folks that said all didn't mean it. So we just have to understand when black folks are a bit cynical about our commitment to all lives and why they insist on black lives mattering, because the system has so long said it didn't. But see, that makes nothing that I just said will be rational to you unless you understand the history, because people of color know that the history of law enforcement in this country traces directly to slave patrols. That's the first iteration of policing. That's not my opinion. That's not something for which there is a rebuttal. It is simply fact. That doesn't mean that I am analogizing modern day cops to slave masters or overseers or the slave patrol. What I'm saying is there is a bright line connection between the past and the present, and those who have suffered that past know it, even if those who have not don't. People of color know, see, that it was law enforcement that enforced the slave codes. Who do you think did that? Not random people, cops. Right. It was law enforcement that enforced segregation after enslavement. Who do you think did that? Not random people, cops. It was law enforcement that pulled those protesters off of sit-in stools in the South in 1960 and beat protesters within an inch of their life during the Freedom Rides. And it was law enforcement that released people to the mob so they could be lynched by the hundreds and indeed by the thousands. Cops did that. That doesn't mean every police officer is a racist or a bigot. I'm not even saying that most are. What I'm saying is that the culture of policing and the history of law enforcement has not been a happy and cheerful one for people of color. Cops are not the folks who come into black and brown neighborhoods to get the cat out of the tree, or give little Billy a ride around to show him how gosh darn exciting it is to be a law enforcement officer. So we're just going to have to understand the way that people perceive the world is rooted in how they've experienced it. And if I've experienced law enforcement in that way, then I'm likely to view law enforcement differently than those who have experienced it a different way. If you want to understand the uprising against police misconduct, you have to know that history before you say one word in criticism of those who stand up against that mistreatment. Because if you don't understand that history and have never spoken against that history, how dare you suggest that folks need to hold their tongue rather than criticizing even harshly those who were supposed to protect and serve. They have every right, going back hundreds of years, to do exactly that. Right? But it won't make sense if you don't understand history. It's not just law enforcement. And I don't think about this just as a scholar of history or as an educator or a writer. I think about it as a dad. Right? So a few years back, I was driving my daughters from school to the dance studio where they were both in company at that time. They were both in the same dance company at that time, both of them dancers since they were very little. And I'm driving them from the school to the studio in downtown Nashville, Tennessee, where we live. It's about an 8-minute drive on surface roads. Same path that we've taken more or less every day for a year and a half. And on this particular day, we get stopped at a red light. It happens to be a red light in the middle of public housing. On either side, public housing. Right? We're stopped at the red light waiting for it to turn green. And like I said, we've made this drive almost every day for a year to a year and a half. But on this particular day, the youngest of my daughters, who at that time was 10, or as the kids like to say, 10 and a half, because they really like to give themselves that extra 6 months, looks around and she looks at me and she says, "Dad, why is it that pretty much everybody in this neighborhood is black?" Now that is an excellent question. I mean, really excellent. Like that is a brilliant sociological inquiry. That is urban anthropology being done in the back seat by my 10-year-old. That's an important question, right? And the good news is, I actually know the answer, which is great when you're a parent, right? Because when you're a parent, man, your kids will ask you questions all the time. You don't have a clue. You act like you do because you want to seem competent in the eyes of your children. But thank God she asked me about that, man. If she had asked me about, like, where does electricity come from, I'd have been like, Google it. I know it has something to do with circuitry, but beyond that, I checked out in science. I don't have an answer for you. But she asked me about the racial demographics of the community. I'm like, I got this. I was excited, right? But now my moment of excitement was sort of tempered by the fact, and I didn't know this thing was going to happen because I'm an only child. I didn't know this was a thing. But apparently, when you're a younger sibling and you ask a question to the parent in the presence of the older sibling, who at this time was 12 or 12 and a half, right? The older sibling will inevitably, without fail, take that opportunity to offer their own answer in the presence of the parent just to show off. I didn't know this. I was all ready. The answer was right here in my throat, right? I'm good. I got this answer. We only got about 5 minutes till we get to the studio, so it can't be a PhD level answer, but I've got it like synthesized in my head. And then the 12-year-old butts in. Rachel says, the younger one, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? Ashton, the older one, says redlining, which is scary accurate if you do know the history. I mean, for real, it was spooky, right? Because I was like, what? How do you know? Do I talk in my sleep? Like, have you been reading my books? What? How do you, is this genetic? Like, how do you know this? The 10-year-old was like, I don't know what that means. I'm like, I don't think your sister does either, but that was a damn good guess. And I said, let's talk about it. We had about 4 minutes, right? So my kid was onto something though, right? Because even if she didn't really know what it meant, that is a huge part of it, or at least that concept, right? What was redlining? For those who don't know, redlining was this thing that was done all the time, perfectly legal, by the way, up until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed, at which point it technically became illegal, but it was still done informally in lots of ways afterward. And what it referred to was the way that banks would literally put maps up on their wall. They would take red markers and they would outline the boundaries of black communities and occasionally Latino communities as well, communities of color. And anyone who lived within the boundaries of the red line, irrespective of your own credit, your own job, your occupational status, your income, irrespective of any of that, if you lived within the boundaries of the red line, you were not going to get a loan. You weren't going to get a housing loan. You weren't going to get a business startup loan. You weren't getting anything from that bank. And as a result of that, communities of color were starved of capital, deliberately, right? Communities of color were starved of capital. Now, the trick is, that's not exactly how they became black and brown, but it is how they became poor. Right? It's very important for us to understand the economic dynamic of race in that sense, right? Because we tend to look at the place that we call the ghetto and think that it was created by the people who live there. Let me assure you, the ghetto was created by people who do not live there, but who viewed those communities as literal holding pens for people they didn't want to live amongst them. So those neighborhoods became impoverished because of deliberate starvation of capital. The reason they became disproportionately of color is also a very interesting story, though, right? Because if you don't know this, you should. Again, if you don't know the history, you can't be released from it. You certainly can't make it change. Public housing wasn't created for the people who live there now, in places like Nashville and so many places around the country. It wasn't created for folks of color. It was created for white people. In fact, if you were a person of color, you couldn't even get into public housing for the first few years of its existence. You were barred from it. It was for white folks, but at the very same time public housing was created, the government also created some other programs, the FHA loan program, later the GI Bill and the VA loan program. And these programs, even though they were theoretically open to all, in practice they were not. 97, 98% of all those benefits for the FHA loans, for instance, government underwritten, government guaranteed loans, went to white families, allowed the white middle class to be built. There was no white middle class prior to those programs. There were simply the haves and the have-nots and virtually nothing in between, but the government intervenes in the housing market for white people, creates these programs. All of a sudden, banks open up the coffers of money because the government's guaranteeing the loan, so if you default on it, it's going to be covered by the full faith and credit of the United States government. And what this does is it allows white families to leave the city and move to the suburbs at a time when people of color could not follow them there. So literally the government was underwriting, subsidizing white flight, subsidizing the removal of white folks from the city into the greener pastures where only we could live. At the very same time, they're locking folks of color in and denying them capital through both public and private forms of discrimination. Now, by this point, we're at the studio. but the lesson is done. Right? And they got it, they both seem to understand. Right? Why was that so important though? Why is that such an important moment, and why do I tell you about it? The reason I tell you about it, and the reason I think it's so important, is that if I don't know the answer to that question, if you don't, and someone asks you, do you think the person who asked the question, in this case my daughter, is going to stop wondering just because daddy didn't know? See, I suspect she's going to keep wondering. She's going to ask the question, and if daddy doesn't know and says, gosh, I'm not really sure, she's going to keep wondering. And what conclusion do you think she's going to reach on her own? See, because there's only one possible one, isn't there? And it's the conclusion that this culture really encourages her to reach. It's the default position of American ideology. In fact, it's rooted in our fundamental secular gospel. It's rooted in our creation myth. It's Genesis 1:1 of American thought. And what is it? It's the idea that wherever you end up, it's all about you. It's all about your effort, your willpower, your determination. So if you made it out of poverty, if you made it out of that neighborhood, it's because you're the best. If you didn't, there's something wrong with you. That's the secular gospel of America. That is Genesis 1:1 for this country. The notion of rugged individualism, which I beg to remind you is an utter and complete myth. How do I know it's a myth? Because there's no such thing as an individual, let alone a rugged one. Human beings are a social creature. We're a social species. We've never lived in isolation from one another. There's never been an individual human being abstracted from their social context. That person doesn't exist, except in some abstract corner of our mind. None of us were raised on an island by a porpoise. If you actually, by the way, ever do meet someone who qualifies as a real rugged individual, please run the hell away from that thing. Because they're going to be feral, like a wild animal, right? They're not going to have language. You're not going to be able to communicate with them, right? They're not going to know about the whole taboo about not eating you, so you need to run and fast. There's no such thing, never has been, right? But we have this mythology, and I know why we have it, because supposedly it incentivizes hard work, right? If I think that I'm the captain of my own ship and in control of my destiny, I'll work harder, blah, blah, blah. But we all know this is nonsense at some level. We all know people, come on. We all know people who've worked incredibly hard their whole lives and have nothing to show for it. And many of us know people that were born on third base, still think they hit a triple, and have never actually had to work all that hard in their entire lives. I've been told that there are even people who got to take over their daddy's $223 million real estate empire in New York City in the 70s when property was cheap. And then, having made billions out of it, wants you to believe that he's a self-made man. I am told that there are such people. Right? Deep down, we all know this notion of meritocracy is at the very least a myth, if not a lie. It doesn't mean that hard work is completely irrelevant, don't get me wrong. And don't get me wrong, I tell my children, right, they can be whatever they want if they work hard, but I put an asterisk at the end of that, figuratively speaking, right? I insist on the asterisk that says, hey, in order for that thing I just said to be true, where you can be anything you want if you work hard enough, you're gonna have to do more than just be the best individual person that you can be. You're going to have to realize that as young women, there are going to be men, and sadly even some women, who are going to view you as lesser because of sexism. That you're going to be dealing with that, and you'll have to figure out strategies for overcoming that, or else that will be a lie, and you won't become everything that you're capable of becoming. And sometimes when I tell other parents that I tell my girls this, they get sort of pissed at me, right? Like, oh, you shouldn't tell them that. You're damaging them. You're setting them up to be permanent victims. No, I'm setting them up to understand the world the way it is, not this country the way that we fantasized it to be. Right? It does not do my children any favors if I teach them that there are unicorns and pixie dust. Right? Life is not a Disney movie. Life is real, and if I don't tell my daughters about sexism, how are they going to prepare strategies for overcoming it? Not just themselves, but collectively working with others. It'd be like sending my girls down a dark alley where there's an electric fence at the end, but I don't tell them about the fence because I wouldn't want to make them neurotic. Oh, just go, really. I know, it's a very dark alley. It's scary, but I'm sure there's nothing at the end of it like a fence. So just run, just go, I'm sure it'll be fine. And they hit the fence, they're like, Dad, why didn't you tell me about the electric fence? Well, I didn't want to freak you out. That would make me a piss poor excuse for a dad. is what that would do, right? So even though we know that we want to encourage hard work, the idea that that's all it takes, if you believe that, getting back to the story about my daughter in this community, right? If you believe that wherever you end up is all about you, and you don't think about any of that historical context I just gave you of both public and private discrimination, deliberately conceived and institutionalized, right? Which is what skewed the distribution of stuff to this day, which explains why white families on average have 15 times the net worth of black families, 13 times the net worth of Latino families. It's not because we worked harder, prayed harder, or are better at investments. I mean, it wasn't black and brown folks that tanked Wall Street. That was just rich white boys. Best SAT scores, best MCAT scores, best business school degrees that money could find, and they lost $12.5 trillion of other people's money in 18 months. So it ain't because we're so smart. Right? But if I don't understand that, then I look at that inequality and I combine the inequality that I can see, whether it's in that neighborhood relative to other neighborhoods or whether it's the wealth disparities that I just mentioned, and I combine that with the mythology of meritocracy and rugged individualism, and I end up defaulting, right, to the position that, well, I guess these people are here living like this because, you know, they just don't really have what it takes, or they don't want it bad enough. And I guess those white folks over there on the other side of town, you know, who are disproportionately at the top of the pyramid, they just must be smarter, they must work harder, right? So it actually encourages racism as a default position. Right? Racism becomes almost rational if you don't question the fundamental core principle of American political ideology. Right? That's some hard stuff to do too, because people don't want to hear it. It's like standing up in the second pew of a church right after the Sunday sermon and insisting that God doesn't exist. Right? For a lot of people, it's very hard, even though we know that meritocracy is not all it's cracked up to be. I mean, give me a break. 1/10% of the people in this country own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90%. Right? 37 people in this country have the same net worth as the bottom half of Americans. 165 million people over here, 37 people over here. If you actually believe that there are 37 people who are just that much damn smarter, or just work that much harder than the other 165 million over on this side, then I got nothing for you, really. Like, you're wasting your time by being here. And I don't mean just at this talk, I mean like in college. You're wasting your time. If you actually believe that, right? Surely we know better. But see, if we don't interrogate it, if we don't question it, then that becomes the default. And it's not just default racism, default sexism. If men are disproportionately here and women disproportionately here, then it becomes rational to have sexist beliefs about who's better, who's more capable, who has a harder work ethic, you know, and really wants it and wants the job the most. Right? It also is a default classism. You start looking down on working class people of all colors, including millions of working class white folks. Right? So we look at folks in Appalachia and go, well, if you just, you know, worked a little harder, wanted it a little more, you'd get out of there. Right? So this actually doesn't serve a lot of people. It's not just that it works to the detriment of people of color, women of all colors. It actually works to the detriment of millions of struggling white folks. Right? Again, if you don't understand your history, you can't address its consequences, and you cannot, in Baldwin's terms, be released from it. In fact, it'll just become worse because you'll rationalize and you'll justify the inequalities you see. Let's think about it with regard to education, since we are, after all, an educational institution, and specifically one that by definition as a community college institution is intended to serve the needs of the community, even more so, I dare say, than a traditional four-year liberal arts college or a research university, right? This is an institution who's embedded, at least in theory, right, in the community, and its purpose, its mission, its goal is to serve that community. Well, to be effective educators within that type of structure, you must know the forces that are shaping that community and potentially misshaping it in certain ways. And the forces that determine and often overdetermine the learning opportunities in those communities for the students before they ever get to you. And if you don't understand what came before the student walks through the door in a college, right, then you can't possibly serve their needs. Or if you don't want to find out, or you don't think it's relevant, or you think it's not your problem, right, to be fixed, that's somebody else's problem to be fixed. But once they get to you, you know, all bets are off and you just do your thing. Either they get it or they don't. If you buy into the notion of meritocracy and so-called rugged individualism, then when you are tasked with the job of educating people at the bottom of a certain power structure, whether that's economic, racial, cultural, linguistic, or otherwise, in terms of immigrant status, et cetera, right? Then it'll be easy, won't it, to look down on certain folks, to rationalize their failures or inadequate performance in the classroom, to not feel the need to do anything extra or special to ensure that they succeed, because we take this colorblind approach that says, well, I treat everyone the same, and isn't that, after all, what I'm supposed to do? No. If people are facing things that other people are not, and you treat them the same, you are engaged in oppression, actually. Right? If certain people are experiencing systemic discrimination on the basis of race and gender, and you treat them the same as people who aren't facing that, you're doing them no favors, you're treating them unjustly, as a matter of fact. You are perpetuating their disempowerment. Right? If you treat my daughters as if they were just like any boy that they sit in class with, then you're ignoring the very real obstacles and experiences that they will face as women, and you are doing them no favors by being, in that case, sex or gender blind. Right? If I treat folks with disabilities, and think about this one, this is maybe the easiest one to get your head around, because ability and disability, that's another identity. Right? It's not just race and class and gender and sexuality, right? Think about how absurd it would be, like when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed back in 91, became law back in 91. Think about how absurd it would have been to say, well, I know we need some civil rights protections for the disabled, but I think those protections need to be disability blind. The hell, like if you pass legislation that is quote-unquote disability blind, that is to say, doesn't take account of whether you've actually got a disability or not, and I'm not going to notice and I'm not going to think about it, then what are you not going to do? You're not going to construct spaces that are truly equitable and accessible for people with disabilities. You're not going to reconstruct classrooms, you're not going to build ramps, you're not going to construct ergonomic workspaces, you're not going to do the kinds of things that you would need to do, right, to actually create equity. If you treat folks with disabilities like able-bodied folks, right, you don't serve their needs because they face obstacles on the basis of this identity. Right? If you treat the deaf like the hearing, and I'm separating that out from the issue of disability because the deaf community will tell you they wish it so, and so I will honor that. Right? People who are deaf, if you treat them like people who can hear, you don't get interpreters. Because hearing people don't need them. Oh, okay then, right? You don't subtitle the movie. You don't closed caption the documentary or the television show or whatever, right? So you have to pay attention to this stuff, and you have to know where it comes from. And when it comes to education, let there be no mistake at all. The disparities that we see in the K-12, which you then get to try to address at the level of college, are not accidental. And they are not incidental. They are systemic, and they are deliberate. And I know that sounds hyperbolic and extreme to some, but it won't take me very long to prove it. How do I know that the system is unequal on purpose? Well, here's why. Because those who crafted America's educational infrastructure have told me so. And I believe them. So we can start with Thomas Jefferson again, because he's always a good place to start with these things. Thomas Jefferson, who was not only a quote-unquote founding father, but also was revered as a very forward-thinking educator in his day. You know, he was the founder of the University of Virginia. For the late 1700s, he was considered a very sort of quote-unquote progressive educational theorist, believed in universal education, but as I'm about to show you, not quite, not really, but you know, more so than most. He talked about the value of learning, right? And the value of knowledge. And in Notes on the State of Virginia, one of his famous writings, he said something very particular about schooling. He said that in his estimation, every community should have a requirement that folks have 6 years of mandatory schooling, which I guess, you know, in the 1780s was like a lot. I don't know. Wouldn't cut it today, but maybe in the 1780s, 1790s, that was basically it. He said 6 years of mandatory schooling. And keep in mind, he's just talking about white people, right? He didn't mean black folks. He didn't intend for them to get any education, formal education. He certainly didn't mean it about indigenous peoples. He didn't mean for them to get any formal education. He intended to extirpate them entirely and to remove them from the country if possible, and said so on a couple of different occasions, by the way. He was just talking about white folks. He was saying white folks basically should have 6 years of mandatory schooling, and here's his reason. He says, so that we can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Interesting. And once again, he's not even talking about black and brown folks. He basically just called the vast majority of white people trash. And white folks still love him. Right? Still love him. And he said, most of y'all are garbage. He said, we're going to rake a few geniuses from the garbage, but make no mistake, it's just a few geniuses. Most of y'all are trash. Now, what is he saying when he says that? Is he saying, because, you know, when I ask teachers why they wanted to be teachers, and I don't mean like college professor teachers, I don't only mean like K-12. I meet a lot of, and sometimes college professors too, but K-12 educators, almost always when I ask them, particularly if they're young and sort of new to the game of schooling, I ask them, why do you want to be a teacher? And they always say, because education is the great equalizer. Yeah, you think? See, I think if you believe that, you're in the wrong profession, and you're not paying attention. Because if education were the great equalizer, then it wouldn't be the case, although it is, that black folks with a college degree are still almost twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be unemployed. Or that Latino folks with a college degree, and this is irrespective of major, by the way, that Latino folks with a college degree, about 50% more likely than white folks with a degree to be unemployed. Asian American and Pacific Islanders with a degree, about 24% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Our indigenous brothers and sisters, about 2/3 more likely to be out of work than white folks, even when they both have college degrees. So if education was an equalizer, none of that would be true. So it clearly is not. But we know it's not because it wasn't meant to be. Thomas Jefferson just told you that. He said, and people listened to him, man. They took him at his word. They implemented systems based on his thinking. And he said straight up, the purpose of education was inequality. Raking a few geniuses from the rubbish is about inequality. How do we know that that didn't go away? Oh, well, maybe that was then, but this is now, and that all changed. All right, well, let's think about it. Let's fast forward a little bit. Woodrow Wilson, early 1900s, before he becomes president of the United States, he's president of Princeton University. And he was also somebody who at the time was considered this very forward-thinking progressive educational theorist. Sort of hard to imagine him being thought of as progressive at anything. He was a vicious bigot, perhaps the most racist president ever to serve in that job. Right? But he was considered a very progressive thinking educator. Right? He wasn't quite at the level of Dewey, but somewhat up in that same sort of echelon. And one of the things he said, which echoed Thomas Jefferson, was he said, what we need is one group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. That was the term they used to use for college education. They just called it a liberal education. So one group to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education, and another group, much larger by necessity in this and every society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and to prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. So what's he saying? It's another very prominent white man, another very prominent progressive educator, basically saying the same thing Jefferson was, a little bit differently, but basically the same gist, right? The purpose of education is not equal opportunity, let alone any kind of equal outcomes for people, right? The purpose of education is for some folks to rule and the rest of y'all to be ruled. Some folks to run stuff and everybody else to work for them. Oh, but maybe that was just in the early 1900s, and maybe that's no longer the operative mentality. Let's see, 2001. Not that long ago. I'm watching Sunday television, one of those talk shows, political talk shows, and William Bennett is on. For those who remember the 80s, you'll remember William Bennett was the former drug czar, and until recently, the worst Secretary of Education ever to hold that position. Once upon a time, he was the least qualified person for that job. He's been bumped from that perch, but he's right there at number 2. He's still seated number 2 on the bracket. Right? And William Bennett is being interviewed, and he's asked a question by the interviewer. And I'm sitting there watching it, right, having some coffee, trying to wipe the sleep from my eyes, watch this show. And the interviewer says, "What would you say is the biggest problem with schooling today in America? Biggest problem with American education, the American educational system," I think is how I put it. And that's a big kind of question. Like, it's a big enough question that if I was on a TV show and somebody asked me that, I might say, you know what, it's a really big question. I want to have a second to think about it because I don't just want to blurt something out. So can we go to break and come back, and then I'll totally hit you up with a really good answer. But I want to give it some thought, right? Because it's a question that deserves some thought. Not if you're Bill Bennett. So the question is asked, what's the biggest problem with American education today? And Bill Bennett, like, doesn't even miss a beat. He says, the biggest problem is too many people are going to college. Interesting. Now, here's the thing. I shouldn't be this way, but I try to cut people slack even when I don't think they deserve it. So in that moment, I was trying to cut Bill Bennett slack. I don't know why. I've obviously stopped, as you can tell by my previous comments about him, but at the time I thought to myself, you know what, maybe, I had that flash in my head, like, you know how sometimes when you're saying something and the words get caught in your throat and you're not able to finish the sentence because like you choke on the words or something, and so it's almost like there's an internal ellipses in your throat, you know, those 3 dots that you put in the middle of the sentence, right? Or like a comma or an em dash or hyphen or some sort of like, and so I'm thinking to myself, maybe that's what happened to William Bennett. Maybe what he meant to say was, the biggest problem in American education today is that we have too many people going to college, who can't actually afford it because we haven't made it affordable. That would have been a really genius statement. I would have been totally down with that and completely stunned if it had come out of his mouth, but still. Or I thought to myself, maybe that's not what he was going to say, but maybe he was going to say, the biggest problem is too many people are going to college, who aren't adequately prepared because we've underfunded and under-resourced K-12 for millions of people. That too would have been a fantastic comment. So I'm trying to cut him slack, but literally within the 3 seconds that it took me to go through this whole thing, which I just told you about in my brain, right, I realized there was no internal ellipses, there was no comma, no em dash, no hyphen, no semicolon, just a period at the end of the sentence. He meant what he said literally, and I remember thinking, surely the interviewer's going to challenge him, because who is he talking about? Like, be specific, please. When you say too many people are going to college, who do you mean? Do you mean the rich and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents? Because I know a lot of them. Are you talking about folks that went to prep schools all their lives and then got into Yale and got gentlemen's C's while they were at Yale? That's what they used to give white men when they didn't want to work hard. Just gave them a gentleman's C. You're talking about folks like that who've gone on to be president of the United States and then bragged about getting C's, and then got into Harvard Business School where they continued to get C's and went on to become president. Is that what Bill Bennett means, that rich and mediocre folks should be in the service industry, right? Maybe working at a hotel, maybe working fast food, maybe working sacking groceries. No, Bill Bennett doesn't mean that people like that shouldn't go to college, even when their academic performance says maybe they ought not. Because he assumes, just like Jefferson, there are a handful of geniuses, we gotta rake them from the rubbish, and like Wilson, some people are suited to college education, other people are suited to manual task, and both Jefferson and Wilson, and I dare say Bill Bennett, knows exactly which one is which in their mind. He's not talking about the rich and mediocre, he's talking about working class people. And specifically people of color, but working class whites as well, who are gaining access to college education, including community college education in numbers greater than ever before. That's an assault on an institution like this one, is what that statement amounts to. It's the mentality of the slaveholder. Because what was the mentality of the slaver? The mentality of the slave owner was what? If everybody learns how to read, who's going to pick this cotton? Right? So if everybody goes to college, who's going to pick up the garbage in my neighborhood on Wednesday? And see, those 3 guys that pick up my garbage, they make $19,200 a year for it. I'm assuming they don't have a college degree. Now, I could be wrong in an economy, you know, that you never know, but the odds are they don't. And yet they perform a much more important function than anybody else in my neighborhood. Right? We don't pay them commensurate with the service that they perform, but think about it. The dude that sells stock 3 doors down, if he doesn't show up to work for 6 months, life goes on. Nobody's going to miss him, except whoever it is whose stock he's forgetting to trade for 6 months. But life will go on. If those 3 guys that pick up my trash take 6 months off, we have plague on my block. People falling out dead, right? Because all of us who live there who have college degrees, you know, we don't know where the damn landfill's at. We don't know where the recycle facility's at. We don't know how to pick up after ourselves. And we got all this formal education, right? So we have a system predicated on saying to some people, even though you do work that's incredibly important, we don't have to pay you for it, and we certainly don't want to educate you, or you'll think you're too good to do it. And how do we know you'll think you're too good? Because I've been told I'm too good. And anybody with a college degree has generally been told that we're too good. So we have an educational system that produces inequality because we have an economic system that's predicated and rooted in inequality. And if you have an economic system rooted in inequality, how the hell are you going to have a school system that's about producing equality? That's not going to work. That's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole, or round peg in a square thing, whatever, you know what I mean? Right? It's like standing at the end of a sausage factory conveyor belt and being surprised when moment after moment it just keeps giving you sausage. It's like being there and going, well, where the hell are the chicken nuggets? Look, fool, did you not read the sign? It says it's a sausage factory. You're not going to get chicken nuggets at a sausage factory unless you retool the damn machine. You're going to get exactly what it was intended to give you. So when Jefferson said what he said, when Wilson said what he said, when Bennett said what he said, and when we have schools that do what? Use standardized tests on unstandardized students and call it fairness. Use tracking supposedly on the basis of ability, but it's not about ability. It's about race and class assumptions and stereotypes and prejudices about who can achieve and who can't. When we have property tax funding mechanisms for the bulk of our public schools, and we have unequal discipline, and we have curriculum that does not reflect the cultural, linguistic, or historical backgrounds of an increasing number of the students in those schools, the majority of whom now in this country in K-12 are students of color, then you can't tell me that that's accidental, because either we're the stupidest people around in history, and we just can't figure out how to create equity in spite of our good intentions, because I think most people have good intentions. I think most people are good people, I really do. I think most folks are good folks. I don't think most folks wake up and want to hurt people. I think most folks want to do right by children, but the problem is, in spite of our good intentions, and in spite of our intelligence, we're relatively smart people, we still can't quite figure out how to produce equity. Either we're not that smart, or the system wasn't set up to produce equity and we're all getting punked into believing that it was. And if the system wasn't set up for equity, you better understand that to be an educator, to actually change that, if you want it to produce equity, you have to be a revolutionary now. You can't just take what is given to you and accept it as it is. That's accepting that rugged individualism myth. That's going back to Genesis 1:1. You can't just take folks the way you find them when the way you find them is the result of systems and structures of oppression. When folks have been damaged, when folks have been marginalized, when folks have been excluded, unless you want to collaborate with that, unless you are down with their marginalization, you have a moral obligation to engage in revolutionary love for their education. You have a moral obligation to insist that you will do whatever it takes, I mean whatever it takes, to eradicate those gaps that continue to separate the haves from the have-nots, whether we're talking about in economic terms, racial terms, cultural terms, gender terms, a combination of all those things. There are no accidents, only precedents. And so when you see that inequality, whether it's in housing, whether it's in law enforcement, or whether it's in schooling, know that. And see, once you accept that it's not an accident, that it's the way the system was structured, it changes the dialogue entirely. Right? Because if you think it's incidental or accidental, you just tinker around the edges, right? And we say, well, if we can just fix those people, everything will be fine. And that's sort of what we do, right? We have a whole educational system predicated on what's called the deficit model, right? This idea that these people, these poor, and sometimes you hear this from nice liberals. God love them. Nice white liberals who say things like, well, it's just they're poor. What are you going to do? They're starving out behind. They're experiencing poverty. They just have so many strikes against them. And I don't know what to do. It's very sad. It makes me cry. But I don't know what to do. Right? So we just need to fix them. But see, if you understand that the system was intended to destroy them, right? Then it ain't about fixing them, is it? It's about fixing the system, right? Or it's about fixing how you teach, so that you can reach folks who've been damaged. The only way you're going to reach folks who've been damaged is if you acknowledge that they've been damaged, because they know. See, folks who've been held back because of economics, because of race, because of gender, because whatever, they know their reality way better than you know it. More importantly, they know your reality better than you know it. Right? People of color know white folks so much better than white folks know people of color. The poor know the rich way better than the rich know the poor. Women understand men far better than the opposite. LGBTQ folk know straight and cisgendered people like the back of their hand because they've been dealing with us forever. And we just discovered them. Right? Folks who face obstacles every day, they don't have the luxury of being oblivious. They don't have that privilege. That's the biggest privilege. Talk about white privilege, straight privilege, male privilege, class privilege. I'm not even talking about money sometimes when I talk about that stuff. I'm just talking about psychology. I'm just talking about the ability to be oblivious to other people's reality and still be called competent. How the hell does that happen? How can I, think about this, how can I be deemed competent enough to be a teacher? Whether it's in K-12 or in college or in grad school, law school, med school, how can I be deemed competent to be a doctor or a nurse or a social worker or a therapist, a psychologist, a police officer? How can I be deemed competent if I don't have to know anything about the folks with whom I'll be working? How is that possible? That I can actually, think about it, I can become a doctor or a teacher in a black or brown neighborhood, and if I'm white, not only will I not be expected to have to know anything about them, I'll actually get patted on the back just for being noble enough to go up in there and try. How the hell does that happen? Oh my God, that's so noble of you. But do you know anything about them? No. And I still get a diploma, I get a degree, I get a certification. White folks don't have to know anything about people of color and we can still get any job we want. People of color don't have that luxury in reverse, am I right? People of color don't get to be ignorant to white folks stuff. People of color have to know our stuff. They have to know our stuff better than we know it. And they damn well better spit it back to us when we ask for it. Right? So they're going to have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know we don't call it that. That is the point. You don't have to specify the origin of stuff when it's taken for granted that it belongs to you. You don't have to be specific about the origin of that literature when it's taken for granted that it's white. That's why we don't have White History Month for those who still can't quite figure that one out. Because we have several, they go by tricky names like May, June, July, August. You don't have to call it white history when that's what you do and you take it for granted and it's considered normative. But how in the hell do we get to be considered competent and let loose on people? See, to be competent as an educator like 50 years ago or 100 years ago is one thing. We're not living in that day. Right. I was having a talk with some folks at a college in Wisconsin a few years back, and I said, you know, if y'all are advertising for a Shakespeare scholar in the English department, right, and you got to interview a bunch of folks, and none of them, now they all know about Shakespeare, wrote a dissertation about something that Shakespeare wrote, all very knowledgeable about Shakespeare's work, but if they don't have any knowledge of the various feminist critiques of Shakespearean literature or multicultural critiques of Shakespearean literature that have developed within the last 30, 40, 50 years, right, among scholars of Shakespeare and Shakespearean literature, then they ain't Shakespeare scholars anymore. You're a really good Shakespeare scholar for 1951 or 1817 or 1639, right? But you're not so good for 2017. See, people have to upgrade their skills. Sometimes I feel that we get in positions and we forget that. So nurses and doctors don't feel they need to keep up with the new research on racism and its effect on health because after all, they went through medical school and they understand what makes you sick and what makes you healthy and how to treat you and how to respond to you and how to engage with you. But of course, they learned that on models that were developed for middle-class white folks. Right? Or teachers sometimes believe, like, I don't have to keep up with the research on the pedagogical approaches that are most effective for teaching low-income folks of all colors and people of color generally math and science. Because I know sometimes math and science folks, they'll check out of this conversation, right? They say, well, this is fine for y'all in ethnic studies, sociology, political science, and anthropology. But now I teach math. Or I teach science. What does it have to do with me? See, the only reason you ask that question is because you don't know. And the only reason you don't know is either because you haven't learned how to use Google yet, or because no one ever told you that you needed to know. But there is research that's been out now. This isn't even new. It's not like last month, and it just didn't show up in your feed yet, right? This has been out for a long minute about pedagogical approaches for teaching math and science to marginalized populations. I almost said underserved, but I hate that word. And we need to stop using it. Because see, when language creates reality, we use language and we marginalize people. So we say things like underserved, underprivileged, underprivileged. I mean, what is that? The hell does that mean, right? Like third grade grammar teacher told me, don't use the passive voice when the active voice will do. And there's nothing that's more passive than to say underprivileged or underserved, right? It doesn't imply that anybody did anything to anybody. It's just, well, there's privilege and I will be damned. There you are under it. There's service, there's you. I don't know how you got down there. What happened? Oh, don't want to know. Don't tell me. It's also a ridiculous term because by definition, right, if there's the underserved, what else must there be? Yeah, the overserved, but that's not a word, so, right? Same thing with overprivileged. You don't hear that one, but there must be such a thing. By definition, again, this isn't politics or ideology, it's just grammar, right? The opposite of under is over, not because I say so, but Roget's thesaurus tells you so, right? If there's an underserved, there must be an overserved, an underprivileged must be an overprivileged, somebody didn't get enough, somebody else got too much. So the system implicates us all, so we got to make a decision then about what we do with that. Right? And I know that for some it's hard because, if you're winning in this system, if it's working for you, like it worked for Thomas Jefferson and people like him, like it worked for Woodrow Wilson and people like him, right? It's easy to sort of, even if you're a really good person, and like I said, I think most people are, it's really easy to get caught up in the idea that, well, it sucks for them, but it's sort of working out for me, so I don't know that I really want to change it. But there's a problem, right? This myth of individualism and meritocracy, it doesn't just hurt the marginalized today, it's a dagger pointed at the heart of just about every one of us. What do I mean by that? Think about this current political moment for just a second. Let's say that for years and years and years, I am told that wherever I end up is all about me, right? That I can be anything I want if I just work hard. Now, if I'm a person of color, I probably have developed a reasonably acute bullshit detector to know that that's a little simplistic. I'm not saying that people of color never fall prey to this thinking, because it's hard not to some extent. But most people of color know it just ain't that simple, right? Because they know their history enough to know it's way more complicated than that. But if I'm white, there's a good chance that I might have had the luxury of believing this. Even if I'm a working class white person. Because think about it, even working class white people historically were able to say to themselves, if I work really hard and do everything right and play by the rules, my kids will be better off than I was, and then their kids will be better off. We could at least assume, even if we came from very, lower income, modest roots, we could assume at least horizontal mobility, right? You know what horizontal mobility is. It's not as good as vertical, but it beats, decreased mobility or downward mobility. Horizontal mobility means my granddaddy worked in the coal mine, my daddy worked in the coal mine, I work in the coal mine, my son's gonna work in the coal mine. In other words, always taking for granted that things will always be there for you. Now, if I'm black, I know better than that. Folks of color have never had the luxury of believing all they had to do was work hard. Are you kidding? Right? Because folks of color know they've been working hard since the jump and never got anywhere for it for hundreds of years. So people of color never got the luxury of believing that myth, at least not in its full baked sense, right? But white folks could. We could sort of say like, yeah, that's how the world works. And there was just enough evidence, at least for us, to keep us believing it. But now what happens if I'm told that, and my family's told that for generations, and I come to believe it, and then all of a sudden the economy changes beneath my feet. Right? And all of a sudden the factories are closing because the boss, who I've been told that I ought to identify with, because one day I'm gonna be the boss. Right? The boss decides it's cheaper to move that factory to Sri Lanka. Right? It's cheaper to move that factory to Honduras, where they don't have to pay decent wages or environmental protection or labor laws, right? Don't have to worry about any of that. And I've been told all I gotta do is work hard and I'll have work. But now I don't have work. Or I've been working in that coal mine and now the coal mining jobs are drying up. And by the way, not because of hippies and environmental regulations. That's a lie. The reason the coal jobs are drying up is because coal mine operators have realized it is cheaper to just blow the tops off of mountains to get at the coal than it is to hire more workers the old-fashioned way to go in and dig it out the way they used to. They're using labor-saving techniques so they can get richer. That's why. And that the demand for coal on a worldwide basis has also fallen significantly. So it's economic changes, cultural changes, and the greed of the people at the top that have put these working class white folks in the position that they're in, but they were told their whole life, wherever you end up is all about you. Now what do I do? How do I resolve this? Because now I'm starting to think there must be something wrong with me, because that's what my country wants me to believe. Must be you, you're just not working hard enough. But I don't want to deal with that shame, do I? Because now I start to feel shame, and I start to feel self-hatred even, and self-contempt. And I have to figure out a way, this is Psych 101, I got to figure out a way to project that stuff onto somebody else. And then a politician comes along, and he tells me, I can take care of your pain. Right? Not only can I take care of it, I can diagnose it for you so you'll know it's not you. It's not your fault. Oh yeah, when those black folks are out of work, it's their fault. When those brown folks are out of work, it's their fault. But when you, salt of the earth, Rust Belt, Appalachian, coal country, white man, when you're out of work, oh, it's not you, it's them. It's those people south of that border. Only this border, we're only sweating this border. Never sweating this border. Not worried about crafty Canadians sneaking into the U.S. to take advantage of our superior health care. Because that'd be weird. Only worried about this one. This politician comes along and says, if I can just build a wall here, everything will be fine. Really? You think that's how capitalism works? You think that capitalism works that way? Like you just build a wall and all of a sudden everybody gets a raise? Is that how you think capitalism works? Like the bosses of America are sitting around going, holy hell, I hope they don't figure out the thing about the wall. Because if they build the wall, we're going to have a hiring spree and we're going to have to give everybody a bonus. So I really hope they don't figure it out. No, the boss doesn't care. You can build a wall, the boss is still going to move the factory. Because capital is always mobile. The wall doesn't stop capital. It's not like a firewall that affects your bank account. You try to send all your money to the Cayman Islands and it hits the firewall and goes boing, and you're like, oh, I should have done this last month. The wall doesn't stop capital. You know what else doesn't stop capital? Mean tweets from the president. Those don't stop capital either. Because I know some folks think, well, they won't move the factory because the president's going to mean tweet him and tell him not to. Stop it! You think a CEO that has like billions of dollars on the line is like, well, I can't wait to get to Sri Lanka to make this $40 billion increase in profits that we were going to have. Oh, wait, the president's tweeting at me. Oh, shit, okay, I guess we'll just stay here. That's not how it works. Capital will always jump borders under capitalism. Goods will always jump borders in a global economy. If you allow capital and goods to jump, but you chain labor to its country of origin, guess what you have done? By definition, you have rigged the game in favor of capital and against workers. And not just the workers down here, the workers right here, north of that border, because they'd be better off having more workers to fight for better wages and working conditions for all working people in the continent, rather than this divide and conquer stuff. But see, if I'm sweating that notion of my own personal failing, because you told me wherever I end up is all about me, and now I'm down here, and now I'm struggling, and now I got a pink slip, and now I can't pay for my health care, and now I can't pay for my kids' college education, and I need to deflect that and project that onto somebody else, and a politician comes along and gives me a scapegoat, I will take it. See, there's a reason. There's a reason that there was a direct correlation, one of the highest correlations, things that was correlated with support for Donald Trump in certain counties and certain voting precincts. You know what one of the number one most highly correlated factors was with Trump support? The percentage of people in that community who were addicted to opiates. Now I want you to think about this for a minute, right? What are, opiate, you've heard about the opioid crisis. Right? It's interesting we call it that, right? Some are old enough to remember there was another opiate crisis in the cities in the 1970s involving street heroin, and we didn't call it an opioid crisis, and we didn't counsel treatment and forbearance and education, right? We treated it like a crime. We called people junkies and we locked them in jail. And then in the 80s, we did the same thing with crack. We didn't have forbearance or any kind of concern or compassion. But now these salt of the earth white people in these rural, small town, dying communities who were always told stuff will be there for you. You don't have to worry about what those people worry about. And now they are having to worry about it, and they're turning to these opioids, and it's killing them, and it's terrible, and it's heartbreaking. But you think it's a coincidence that there's a correlation between that and the support in those communities for Trump? There isn't. And by the way, when I say there's no coincidence, please don't misunderstand. I'm not actually saying that you have to be high to vote for Donald Trump. That's not actually my argument, though it's a fascinating sociological proposition that some of you in the room who know how to do regression analysis might want to test for yourself. But it's not my hypothesis. Right? My argument is much simpler than that, but I think much more important. What is an opiate? I mean, pharmacologically, what is an opiate? An opiate is a drug that is designed to do one thing only: block pain receptors. Right? So when a politician comes along and says, I can take away your pain, that person is a walking, talking, breathing human version of an opioid. Does the same thing an opiate does, and doesn't solve the problem, right? Because an opiate, if you got a crushed disc, and they give you opioids to deal with the pain, you still gonna have to have surgery on that. You realize, right, that the opiates are not gonna actually fix your back. If you have cancer and they put you on opioids to deal with the pain, you're still gonna have to have something other than just the opioids. That'll stop you from hurting for a while, that won't save your life. Right? The same thing is true here. You can build walls, you can talk about cracking down on immigrants, but do you realize, the last 10 years there's been a net outflow of migrants from Mexico and south of the border, not influx. More are leaving than are coming. We're now at the lowest level of actual entries since the mid to late 1970s. Right? So it ain't really going to solve any problem. That's not why the jobs aren't there. Right? Mexicans didn't tank Wall Street, that's for damn sure, right? Documented or Right? But so we have to understand that this mythology that I'm asking us to critique, this ideology that's so central to America, I'm not asking you to critique it as an act of charity. Right? I'm not saying we need to really interrogate this so that these people over here will have a better shot. I'm saying this is dangerous for all of us. Right now it might be working for some of us if we're doing okay, but wait around a minute, right? Because in a global economy, in an ever-shifting culture, in a society that's always changing, those who don't know how to adapt, because they've never had to adapt, at least not to the same extent as others who've always had to adapt and have always had to persevere and have always had to be resilient and have always had to overcome. If you don't know how to do that, you're going to be in real trouble. Right? And that's what I think we're seeing in this country today. We got millions of white folks that are in real pain, but they're misdiagnosing their pain, and they're allowing themselves to be misdiagnosed, right? And maintain faith in a system that wasn't set up for most of them either. Right? That's where we're at as a society, and that has to change, or else nobody's children are safe. That has to change, or else this society as a whole is not going to survive. By the year 2030, half of this country is going to be folks of color, half are going to be white. That's just a fact. And no wall's going to stop that, because immigration isn't what's driving it. You know what's driving that demographic reality? The fact that white folks on average are 9 years older than Latinos and black folks on average, and older people have fewer babies. It's just about birth rates. Right? And it's not even that the birth rates are that much higher for folks of color, but if you're older as a population, you're going to produce less babies on the whole, right, per capita than a group that's younger. And so just based on birth rates alone, without any immigration, you could shut down immigration tomorrow, theoretically, wouldn't stop that demographic shift. So we better get with it. We're either going to create equity or we're not going to survive. Because if we get to 2030 and half the population, people of color, are still twice as likely to be unemployed, how are we going to survive? 3 times as likely to be poor, how are we going to survive? 1/15 the net worth, how are we going to survive? Double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight babies, 9 years less life expectancy, how are we going to survive? The answer is we're not. So this is not about charity, this is about radical self-help. This is about figuring out how we are going to commit ourselves to the creation of equity, not, I beg to remind you, so that we can make America great again, but so we can make America great for the very first time for everybody. Thank you all so much for being here.